This is the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe. Yes, so just to start the video off with, this is going to be as spoiler light as possible, so you'll notice that in the background, I'm not really showing any of the new content, except for a little bit of a snippet at the very end of the video will be some of the new content, but it's not all that spoilery, it's just one little segment. The rest of the footage will be from stuff that was already in the original version of the game, just to preserve that spoiler factor, because I want you to find this stuff for yourself, and I want to make sure not to spoil a whole bunch of stuff in the background, and of course I would have to talk over all of it anyway, which would sort of defeat the whole purpose, right? So here we go. The Stanley Parable. What is the Stanley Parable if you've never actually played the original? Well, it actually started out as a mod originally, but eventually became its own standalone game on Steam, and it came out in 2013, the standalone version did, and it was basically a walking simulator, but it wasn't just a walking sim, it was basically the walking sim in my opinion, because it was the game that did this genre the best. It was the game that actually made it most like a video game with a ton of interactive elements and a lot of very interesting stuff to say, instead of just hold W to turn the page to the next part of the story. There's a lot more to it. So this makes the Stanley Parable very much an example of how to do a genre like this and still preserve the fact that it is an interactive video game that you're supposed to play rather than just watch. It is quite a clever, very well-written experience that has an absolutely fantastic narrator named Kevin Brighting. And Mr. Brighting's lovely voice will be following you throughout your adventures in this office building. You are Stanley, a dude, who lives a very sad life of mostly just pressing the buttons that he's told to press, until one day he wakes up in his office and finds out that his entire building is empty, and he sets out to figure out what in the world is going on. And the narrator will at first start as exactly that, just a narrator, someone who's describing the actions that you're taking, but will soon turn into more of like a deuteragonist, or like a protagonist slash antagonist, depending on exactly what you're doing and if you're actually obeying him or not. And you'll sometimes feel like you're suffering together, you'll sometimes feel like he's the cause of your suffering, and you'll sometimes feel like neither of you really know what is actually going on. But it all culminates in this really cleverly written experience that asks a lot of questions about what video games are, and about what art is, and about what the interactivity means, and all sorts of things like that. It is very clever without trying too hard to be super profound. It actually ends up being quite a profound experience, even though that it's not trying to be an art house piece or anything, mostly because it does a very good job of giving you some interesting choices, giving you some false choices and some actual choices, and also subverting your expectations along the way a whole bunch of times and causing some really creative and odd things to happen. There are things that you think you could do to maybe break the experience, things that might break the game and it might not otherwise have any narration for, and it turns out as soon as you do it, there is in fact narration for that even lampshades the fact that you thought you probably broke it, but it turns out you actually didn't, because, well, here we are. And the game is just full of stuff like that. Now, if you want to just beat the game, if you want to just go through what the narrator tells you to do from beginning to end, it's a very short experience. It'll only last you probably about 10 or 15 minutes if you're doing a lot of stopping and looking and listening to all the narration stuff. If you're just rushing through it, you can beat it even faster than that. But that's only to get to the one escape ending, the sort of initial number 0 ending of the game. And the game is a lot more than just that one ending. So yes, it has a lot more content in it than just that 15 minutes. And you are encouraged to restart the game and try it again and again and again, trying different choices, trying different permutations of various things and causing odd, unexpected things to happen until you come across some other ending. And there are a very large number of endings in this game, some of which can even permanently change the experience to help you find future endings that were previously not available until you got a different ending that eventually led you to be able to do those things. It is very much like a spiderweb experience that expands outward into a wide world from that initial number 0 escape ending to a whole bunch of crazy nonsense that you can eventually find out if you keep exploring and keep trying new things and keep trying to sort of beat the game at its own game, right? Keep trying to do things that it doesn't expect. Keep trying to find stuff that's out of bounds or that you wouldn't expect it to have an answer for, because almost every single time you'll find out that actually it does. There's something really interesting about this game's aesthetic, and that's because it of course was a source mod and eventually a source game. And anyone that has played a lot of games on the Source Engine will know that playing something on the Source Engine is like going home. It has a very cozy feeling to it. It's something that you get used to. You settle into the Source Engine, and it's something that feels very familiar. There's just something about the Source engine that does this more than other engines, in my opinion. It's that feeling of kind of weird, almost slightly scariness of an empty server, the feeling of the movement, the way that its assets and props look. It comes together to make a very specific type of atmosphere. And the Stanley Parable, the original, was a game that was very heavily about using this atmosphere to tell a story. Or rather, a whole bunch of smaller stories, sometimes depending on what you were going for. And the fact that this game is no longer on the Source engine kind of worried me at first, that it would lose some of that indescribable Source engine feel, that atmosphere that those games have, that was kind of integral to the way the Stanley Parable felt to play as a game. But somehow they've managed, at least in my opinion, to actually keep that feeling even though they're in Unity now. It's really fascinating to see these like old Source engine assets, like the pencil sharpener and the old IBM computer models and all that stuff that you recognize and you see it as a Source engine asset, but to see it in a new engine instead with some better lighting effects and different materials and stuff, it's weird. It's simultaneously nostalgic and also kind of unsettlingly new. So I think that's actually a good thing. I think that feeling of like uncomfortable newness actually works in favor of the game because it's what replaces that old Source engine feel that you need. It's a void that you can't very well describe but is felt by its absence. So I gotta say, I do really appreciate the effort that's gone on to making this game look and feel and play like a Source game in the way that it needs to still be the Stanley Parable. You know, coming across these offices and all the assets and things, it's like seeing an old friend with a new haircut, basically. But of course, Ultra Deluxe isn't just about putting it on a new engine and updating the visuals and stuff, it's also about new content. So if you've played the Stanley Parable before, what is actually new? Is it worth getting it even though you know what the game is? And I've got to say, personally, I think that it is. I think if you've never played the Stanley Parable before, this is an extremely good purchase because it is a whole bunch of content and endings and stuff for you to explore and have a good time with. But if you have played the original, it actually does a good job of subverting the expectations that you're going to have for what the new content is going to be like, and it sort of plays around with you a little bit. And when you start up the game, it even asks you straight up, have you played the original Stanley Parable, yes or no? And it sort of changes a little bit about how it presents its new stuff to you based on your answer. And of course, without wishing to spoil anything, they've done a really good job of loading a whole bunch of new stuff in the game. So if you're curious, if you're worried that is it just the Stanley Parable but shinier, no, there is actually a good amount of new stuff here and a whole bunch of new narration still by Kevin, still sounds great, and in fact it seems like they've done a really good job of mixing the narration to where it sounds the same as the old narration. You know what I mean? Like in some games that have updates like this, the new voice acting will have a vastly different sound quality to the previous voice acting if it's old enough, because it's recorded in a new time with new equipment in a new place, it'll sound different. But in my opinion, the new voice acting actually sounds exactly the same as the old. There is no noticeable jarring difference in audio quality or anything. It sounds great, and they've done a really good job of making sure that there isn't this jarring transition from old to new. And it's been 9 years, man. You know, that's a long time for voice acting and recording techniques and stuff, so I'm impressed by how similar it actually sounds, and I think that example actually kind of encompasses my whole opinion of the entire game. It's that there have been a lot of care and attention put into those little details like that to make this a really nice sort of game of the year wrapped up experience of the original but updated and with a bunch of new stuff too. So it's sort of a no-brainer if you really enjoyed the Stanley Parable, and it's also a no-brainer if you were interested in the game but never actually got to play the original for whatever reason. This is a really, really fantastically well-written example of what a walking simulator can be, how it can play with the player's expectations, how it can nurse those expectations in different ways in order to get a rise out of you and to get certain interactive elements put in front of you that you expect to work a certain way because it is a video game, but the video game in this case is actually smart enough to realize that you know that and to expect how it's going to work and to play around with you a lot and to do some unexpected things that you will remember. Your first several run-throughs of this game will definitely be very memorable as you're exploring all the narration and finding out what the limits of the game world are and stuff like that. There's a lot of really great narration to be had here and some honestly quite good points being made in terms of how games are designed and stuff too to listen to. You know how Portal makes you feel really smart when you're actually doing really well in it, and it has that source engine atmosphere that only Portal can have? Well, this game goes for a similar idea. It kind of makes you feel smart, or otherwise makes you think in ways that you didn't necessarily expect to when you woke up that morning, and it has that atmosphere to it, despite not even being on the source engine anymore, that feels comfy to climb into and experience a couple more run-throughs of this afternoon after your lunch or whatever. It's just that kind of game. It's a game that you can enjoy as a bite-sized experience and get a couple of endings and feel good about it because it made you think a little bit, or it's a game that you can sit at for several hours and explore every little nook and cranny and find little silly Easter eggs from other games and other things that you might not expect to have narration but actually do, and just explore as much of it as you can. There's a lot here to see and to hear, and as I said, the narration is excellent. The dude's voice, I love his voice, it's so good, and his inflection and stuff is all really good, and some of the new content I've noticed, he plays around with putting a little bit more like emotion behind his voice than like thinly veiled contempt, which is what a lot of the narration is in the beginning. It's pretty cool. I think they've done a really good job with this, and it is worthy of a re-release. It's not just, you know, a spit shine on an old game, it's making an old game in a new engine that also has a bunch of new stuff for you to find, and because of the nature of how the stuff in this game works, it is very much worth finding that new stuff because it's going to come along with some, well, a little bit of philosophy here, a little bit of game design theory there, and a whole bunch of really good narration to pack it all together, because that's what the Stanley Parable is. So yeah, I will always recommend this game no matter what version it is, because it is a fiercely intelligently written game that is a joy to go through, and having even more narration to experience is always a good thing. I will put a link to the Steam store page in the description below this video if you want to go and check it out yourself. Definitely do so if you are at all interested in this concept, or even if you don't really know about it but you played games like, say, Bastion and enjoyed the very dynamic way that the narrator sort of alters his narration based on what you're doing and that sort of idea, because that's basically what this game is. And yeah, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.